public takes a dim view often of partisanship or the lack of bipartisanship, believes that polarization and squabbling cause gridlock, unseemly behavior, national embarrassment, and international misunderstandings. But unfortunately, the public is ambivalent as well. It likes a good political fight. It is often more polarized than its representatives in the Congress, and it presses Congress to be mean and nasty and adamant and recalcitrant and whatever. The public demands that Congress fight and then berates it for so doing. But the public is often ambivalent and half-right. It's telling its representatives to balance the budget but lower their taxes, to show those terrorists what for, but don't take my boy for your war, and cut their subsidies but double mine. And so it's very difficult for Congress not to get caught up, because it is a representative body, in the ways of its constituents want it to act. Dr. Bond showed you the history of partisanship in the Congress, and that was, I think, a very good beginning. I think it was worse in the old days, particularly at the beginning of the 19th century, and then again in the pre-Civil War days, when important issues gripped the country, and there were interesting things to fight about. When I came to Congress, I was privileged to serve as long ago as Lou Frey was even there. Congress was a very competitive arena. You remember Teddy Roosevelt called politics an arena in which bloody gladiators struggle with one another. And it is important that ideas clash in that conflict. And you do need to have parties, and they do need to stand for something. But when we were in the Congress, times were a little easier. As Bush 41 might have described them, they were kinder and gentler. And while the minority in which I served for 20 years was, I thought, cruelly suppressed, at least those of us in the minority who had reasonable ideas could inflict them in our committees. We could occasionally amend bills on the floor of the Congress, or floor of the House, and we could occasionally defeat bills. Now, it wasn't very often. The majority's job was to pass its program, and it did, and sometimes ruthlessly. Nevertheless, we could get in our licks, and serving in the Congress was perhaps sometimes unpleasant, but it was a tolerable occupation. Now, the real polarization began about the ending of my time in Congress, and really by the turn of the century, we were pretty well polarized, and in the last 10 years, we've eroded almost the last edges of whatever comity was, that's C-O-M-I-T-Y, not E-D-Y, has been erased. And there are a number of reasons for them. Some of them were brought out in some of the questioning. Everyone has their totem pole of why people are lacking these civility in the Congress, as one of the questioners talked about. But there is a very fine line, and Dr. Bond's charts up there show you that there is an ebb and flow to partisanship or bipartisanship. And as I said in the beginning of this presentation, you want comedy and you want civility, and you sometimes need bipartisanship, but you do not want to take all of the fight out of the two parties. You need competition. You need the clash of ideas in the arena. Now, my judgment is we're probably at the bottom of a cycle. Perhaps the health care bill will be the end of it. because I think there are some good signs for the future. In the old days, there used to be a theory of political science called the theory of the concurrent majority, which says nothing of importance ever gets done in policy changes in the United States without at least the tacit consent of the opposition party, whether the opposition party are farmers or Democrats or Republicans or doves or hawks or whatever. That policy didn't seem to have worked in healthcare, but my guess is we may have bottomed out, and that is my hope at least. I meet with members of Congress regularly in Washington, and I do note, particularly among the younger members, a kind of a yearning to work together and an acknowledgement that while this healthcare was a big, important issue, the really big issue that faces us is the fiscal crisis that we will be in less than a decade unless we change our ways. And there is a feeling in Congress that they have to do that in a bipartisan way, the old way to solve problems, giving a little bit to both sides and trying to send no one away from the table totally dissatisfied. So if you believe in bipartisanship, I think there is a chance for the future, and I think we're moving in the right direction. Thank you.
Congressman, obviously we need your words on bipartisan too, but if you wouldn't mind me bridging the conversation slightly here, something to be said about healthcare maybe moving toward the bottom of this cycle is that we have to remember that healthcare has been one of the most contentious battles in Congress for a very long time. So for this one to get extra ugly, it's not that much of a surprise, is it?
It really isn't, because it's transforming 16, 17% of the economy. It affects everybody in this room. It affects your parents, your grandparents, and so it's not just a laser beam of an issue. It affects the whole country. And there's very much, quite a bit at stake here, and there are philosophies and ideologies that are on the line here, and coming together on this has been very difficult. But I want to circle back to that, because I think that Congressman Frenzel made an interesting point where he hopes that we're at the end of a cycle. I want to take you there, but first I want to make a couple of opening remarks. And I want to congratulate everybody for being here and having an interest in our government. Carl Albert, the former Speaker of the House from Oklahoma, wrote a book called The Little Giant. That was him, The Little Giant. I think he was shorter than me, if that's possible, but he said that he was influenced by a congressman that approached him in his classroom when he was a young man to go into politics. And I don't think that I will give you such an enlightening speech today that you will maybe take that course, but I hope that you are attuned to what is going on in politics, because sometimes I think that it gets so much coverage in the media, and that members of Congress are vilified to the extent that people are turned off from public service. Lou Frey and I have spent a lot of time traveling around this country and in foreign countries talking to young people about about public service in the Congress, and I hope that you will also look at it as a possible vocation. I wanted to tell you a little war story. It'll just take a minute. In 1982, I ran for the House of Representatives. I was a young guy. I was 35, and I thought that I could beat an incumbent who was serving in the 1st District of Idaho. I'm a Democrat from Idaho, and if you follow politics in this country, it's tough to get your brain around being a Democrat from Idaho, because it's the most conservative state in the country. But I was young, ambitious, and eager to move to Congress. And as I was running, I went to my neighbor, Tom Foley, who was not yet the Speaker of the House, and he was chairman of the Ag Committee of the House. And I asked Tom Foley, my neighbor in Spokane, if he would put on a fundraiser for me in Washington, D.C. to help fund my campaign. And Tom Foley, always the gentleman and the diplomat, came back and said that he had a policy of that he would not help an opponent of a sitting member. He would not help an opponent of a sitting member, even if that opponent was a member of his own party. And my opponent was sitting in Congress at the time. Now you fast forward, that was 1982 to 1994, not that many years later. And when I was running for re-election, 12 of my colleagues came into my district to campaign against me and to tell my constituents that I was really quite a liberal in Washington, D.C., and I was really pulling the wool over my constituents' eyes. I just tell you that story because in the span of 12 years, the tone changed and that the practices changed. And I'm not really sure what it was, although Congressman Frenzel said that he thought that partisanship had hit quite a height in the early 90s, and I was there to witness that. And there are many reasons for this, because so much was at stake. I think you had a lot of moderates in Congress at the time that were in the minority who were getting what they wanted from the majority by working with them. But there's something that's very specific about the change in Congress. As the staff member, Lauren, is that you? Or
No,
okay.
I did not touch my iPhone. It's
as
here. It's on vibrate. It wasn't me.
As Congressman Micah's staff mentioned, and do you remember him saying this? He said that people travel back and forth with a certain schedule. It used to be a long time ago when it was quaint and travel was different, that members of Congress would actually move to Washington, D.C. with their families, and their families would live there, and they didn't go home as often. Now the members of Congress are essentially commuters. Even if you live in Idaho or California, you commute, your families aren't there, so you go and you serve, and there isn't the interaction among members of Congress that brings you to the point of civility and getting to know people. It's very hard for people, if you're sitting next to somebody there, to say something bad about somebody that you know, or that you've traveled with, or that you've been out to dinner with, or that your wives or your spouses know each other. But now there's been a separation, and it really happened, I think, in the Gingrich Revolution in the 1993-94 cycle. So there was a time when Newt Gingrich said we should separate and not interact with people so that we can hold together in a partisan way. And I agree with Congressman Frenzel that we do need partisanship, but I know, and maybe you saw John Boehner on TV last night, I got to know John Boehner on a trip, and he and I went to Congress together back in 1991, but they're not doing that anymore. So the schedules are really playing quite a role. Media are playing quite a role. I really love the question that Lauren asked you about where you get your information. In today's market, if you listen to Rush Limbaugh, you're probably not reading the New York Times. And if you're listening to Rachel Maddow, you're probably not reading, the Wall Street Journal. And so that people are getting their information where they want to get a certain ideological point of view, and they're not getting it from an objective point, which has heightened the partisanship. And I really decry this lack of civility and comity, although I do look at it from a historical perspective. When the pamphleteers, if you want to do a research project or a term paper, look back at the pamphleteers at the time of Thomas Jefferson, where they put things out in their media of the day, which was scandalous. I mean, it was horrific what they were saying about Thomas Jefferson. But he lived through it, and we live through it now. Now, I think that we would not have the call for bipartisanship so much if we didn't have 10% unemployment and that an economy that was in a recession and in danger of collapsing. And with so many people facing medical bankruptcy and so much at stake. In my last campaign in 2008, I came up with the term that I thought people felt that the country was unraveling in a sense. I don't care if it was the violence on television or the violence in the video games or what they saw on television with regard to the members of Congress. But as they thought it was unraveling, they wanted us to come together in what they thought was the greatest institution and work together towards a common goal because they knew that a lot was at stake. Americans think that we're selling our debt, which we are, to China, that we're becoming a third world nation, that we're producing jobs that we're outsourcing to another country, and that your future is not as great as it should be. And if we all came together as Americans, then we would be much better off. In fact, President Obama talked about a post-partisan world, and what he was really talking about was leaving partisanship behind. So you get back to Lauren's question about where we are right now, and the point that Congressman Frenzel mentioned about, are we really, did we just hit a peak here with this issue? I think if he means on an issue, we may have hit a peak, but folks, this partisanship is going to be carried out throughout the next election. So for the next 8 months through November, we're going to see a great deal of partisanship. And we're going to see various arguments that have been used repeatedly on this healthcare issue that are going to be taken into the campaigns. Now, yesterday's vote was a partisan vote. And every person that voted, every member who voted for it, will be the deciding vote in the ads that will be run against him or her, if they are viewed as vulnerable. And there will be huge targets painted on the people who are in very vulnerable districts. So this partisanship is going to continue. We also have Supreme Court decisions which now say that corporations can spend as much money as they want and are regarded as a person. That could play out in this election. A question was asked earlier by the lady on civility. I couldn't agree with you more. I think what we need to do is bring people back together. I hope that they spend more time with one another and that they have a regard for the institution. What bothers me as a former congressman is when members of Congress will run against the very institution that they serve. I think that that is not the sign of a dedicated public servant. If they don't like the institution, I have an argument that they should just simply exit and leave. But the minority will say that the majority is operating under martial law, that their voices are being stifled, and it is all for public consumption. And we will have to take these arguments, make our own determinations. And I'll just close by saying that this call for bipartisanship is sort of a pox on both of your houses, is that the Democrats and the Republicans have to be careful on how they conduct each other. And how they talk to one another will be regarded by the voters of our country as being a measurement of whether they deserve to get reelected or whether we will have continued faith in the system. It's sort of like, you know, this thing about obscenity, is that you know it when you see it, you don't have to necessarily define it, is that civility is the same way. And it will be on the Democrats' back as well as the Republicans' back. The reason that so many of you are now in the independent space and regard yourselves as independents is because you're a little bit upset with both Democrats and Republicans. And this happens in the cycles of politics. It will play out in the next election, and whether the Republicans take over the House as they did in 1994 remains to be seen. They need to pick up 40 seats. But everything was at stake last night. It was like all in a poker game, is that both sides were all in. And now you have to make the decision whether partisanship worked. And I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Excellent. I have a quick question to start us off. And when I was walking in and this group was exiting for their break and they were coming back in, the first thing I heard, if you're the one who said it, you don't have to raise your hand or anything, but I heard one young man say, now, why would we listen if there was civility? Civility? We're not going to listen unless there's some sort of controversy. I don't know if I'm definitely paraphrasing here. It wasn't definitely a quote. But I think from this generation's perspective, and forgive me for saying this, but there's certainly something to be said about younger people and their draw to confrontation, conflict, controversy. It's in our television shows. It's in our younger news broadcasts. Do you believe that Congress people are actually starting to do more of that in order to get more media attention and in general to get the attention of the voters who are not the older people who want us all to get along? What do you think?
It certainly is a truism that congressmen will do anything to excite the attention of the media or the public. Yeah, I think that's part of the trend. We have seen it in media, in our culture, and in our our general discourse. But my guess is that most Americans still believe that civility is a better course, and that you can have competition and you can have a clash of ideas without being nasty and miserable about it. It seems to me that politicians ought to be campaigning to tell people what a wonderful person he or she is, rather than telling people what an awful person the opponent is. And as Congressman LaRocca suggested, about the end of the decade of the 90s in the last century, politicians began describing their opponents as not as misguided, as we used to do in the old days, but as being evil, being some kind of really bad people who were going to wreck the world. And that's a path which we have followed and has accelerated. I certainly hope that it will run its course shortly, because I don't think you can expect to have responsible legislation in an environment of that kind of animosity, vituperation, etc.
You think it's going to run its course, Congressman?
Well, I really like your question, because I think we're into a media environment of winners and losers, and that that is played often in the media like conflict, and that there isn't much discussion about how we got to a certain outcome. And people just want to know who won, who lost, and were they good guys or bad guys. And that's fed by the media, I think, in the 24/7 news cycle. And Congressman Frenzel said, yes, members of Congress feed that because they understand the cycle and they want to stay involved. And then there are all of the people who are the message mavens and of the parties who are trying to score points. And what I really decry right now, and I think this is part of the reason for Americans wanting more bipartisanship, is that we're into an era right now of I don't mean to be overly academic about it, but of anti-intellectualism. And it's like if somebody says something thoughtful, then they don't seem like they're one of the people. And if you can say it in terms that are below a John Grisham novel of short sentences and of 8 words and so forth, then it seems like you really understand the people and that you're in touch with them. And so I think this trend towards anti-intellectualism, if you will, is a dangerous course, and it's getting fed by the media.
Do you ever think that, in general, a Republican or a Democratic side would separately win, or is there ever a side that wins, or does the government just fail its people, as in both Republican and Democrats? Do they both take the blame, or do they both get credit, or do they separately get credit, or?
Well, they try to take credit, right? Depends on who. I'm assuming you mean after a vote is taken, or when it all comes out in the wash. Okay, let's rephrase the question. I think probably the answer will be when election time comes around, who wins and who loses based on what was decided in the past term. Am I right?
Yeah. But we've had efforts on campaign finance reform. There's a bill that's called that McCain-Feingold, and you have McCain, a Republican, and Feingold, a Democrat, and that's what people sort of long for, these people coming together and bringing their teams together and forging a consensus, as Dr. Bond talked about earlier.
Did that answer your question?
Not really.
You win. For example, I would assume last night someone won. The Democrats say they won. But is it really a victory? It depends.
Well, yes, it may be a Pyrrhic victory if it kills them in November. But the thing about American politics is that it is a process and not an event. Now, some of the bills are so big, like health care, that they become an event. But one of the problems the press has, and one of the problems that politicians have with the press, is that they do want to do, as Larry suggests, have a winner and a loser and a white hat and a black hat. And often, like budget or like fiscal problems, it's an ongoing process. It's an up and down, and they're very hard to report on, and there often are not clear winners and losers. And so politicians sometimes have to ascribe goodness to some of their actions that may not always
It's up
be
for
there.
interpretation.
Let me just make a point that there's a tremendous responsibility on you as the voters to sort of sort this out. And the role of the opposition is to oppose. Let's be clear about that. But think of how they try and sidetrack us. For example, death panels. We haven't heard anything about death panels lately because that was sort of put aside. Or that they'll say, oh, the bill is 2,700 pages long, like if it was 2,500 pages long, it'd be okay, but 2,700 is wrong. It's like it's so big that it's going to affect you negatively. So a lot of these messages from the opposition standpoint, and I'm not just picking on the Republicans, the Democrats do it as well, but they're focus group tested, and then they're meant to touch a nerve with the voters, to send you through the roof and to build your anger. And obviously the anger has been built now in certain segments of the country, and we'll have to see how that plays out in November. But we've got.
Yeah, and I'd like to speak up as a former member of the opposition. I served 20 years in the minority. And when any proposition comes up raised by the majority, you have a number of choices. And your first choice is that we can help them perfect their bill or their policy by testing it with amendments and so forth, and we do that. And then we try to negotiate some sort of compromise with them. Now, if all that fails, if you don't believe in what they're doing, you have a responsibility to vote against it. But as we both have suggested often, it is better to do that with civility than with nastiness.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, my question is, if the economy is so bad, then why are you having such a big bill changed when it can determine so many people's outcome, like as the economy-wise? And why are we in a war that's costing $1 billion when Obama in his election said earlier that he wanted to pull our troops out, but we really pulled them in more?
You know, the Democrats are going to contend that this is deficit neutral and that it will actually reverse the deficit. And so I think the burden is on the Democrats now to say how they're going to pay for this bill. The president said in his State of the Union speech that it would not cost a dime, and now the burden is on them to do this and to show that they did not just transfer the cost to the states and so forth. So there's going to be a big burden on them to explain to the American people. I think what they're going to do coming out of the chute here is that they're going to show the immediate benefits of the bill, because there are things that come on downstream here in terms of costs and other things. But their tactic will be that they will try and show the immediate benefits, sort of like what happened with Social Security. As soon as they passed the bill, then you could go and you could apply for Social Security. And what they want to do is have people who have been left out of the healthcare system immediately go apply with pre-existing conditions and then be brought in, and they'll make a big deal out of that. I think that will be part of their strategy coming out, and that they layered the bill so that there were benefits coming out. And there were a lot of the 20 or so Democrats were critical of the bill because they didn't believe that they believed that it was too costly. So they're going to have to talk to the American people about that.
So,
Wait,
in
the way I
other words,
understood
there's
the
a bit of a
question-
gamble here. We're not really sure how it's going to become deficit neutral, and if it will, over 10 or 15 or 20 years.
Yes.
As I understood the question is, why did we do health care when we had the other the problem of recession, the bad economy, and the fiscal problem. Why didn't we wait until we cured those? I think that's a legitimate question, and I would have been driven by those arguments more than by the need to repair the healthcare system immediately in the ways that it was done.
And as far as the war goes, do you have any comments on that? You definitely have the most historical perspective.
I do. I mean, the Democrats passed a massive economic stimulus bill, and a lot of it has not yet hit, but they were able in the first year to stop massive layoffs in education and keep the schools funded. But now the state governments are wrestling with strained budgets in the second year. But my point is that they felt that they did deal with economic stimulus early, and now they moved on to health care, which was readjusting 16–17% of the economy. And they think that this is actually going to benefit Americans in getting back to work. Now, let me say, you know, everything has been supersized in Washington this year. They've bailed out Detroit. They bailed out the banks. They've tried to put people back to work and stop the recession from turning into something else. And now they've taken on health care, and the House actually took on the climate change and energy. So you can't say they haven't been busy. You could disagree with the outcomes and the approach that they've taken, but there have been monumental pieces of legislation that have been attempted in a very tough time. And all of this with 2 wars going on, and with the attempt to be transparent about paying for those wars, and contrasting that with the Republicans who voted for the wars and didn't vote for appropriations to wage the war.
Well, they voted for them, but always in arrears and
Right.
in supplementals, which confused people about the cost. It is hard to fight 2 wars to revise 16% of our economy in healthcare at a time of recession. And I think there's a good question of how you set priorities and whether you try to do them all at once. When you're involved in 2 wars, it's pretty hard to disinvolve. The president is trying to follow the policies of his predecessor and is withdrawing from one of those wars. But we're going to continue the other one, and I think it is necessary for the country to do that. I think the real question was when we got involved in that war, and times were pretty good, why we weren't willing to pay for it. And normally when we feel drawn into a war in this country, we raise taxes to try to support it, or we cut back something else. We didn't do that. Instead, we cut our taxes and said, you have to suffer for this war, so we're going to cut everybody's taxes. It turned out not to be a great idea.
I would just, Congressman Frenzel just hit on an interesting point, I think, that maybe we should focus on just for 10 seconds here, and that is bipartisanship in war. The Vietnam War was bipartisan when they voted on the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, but in retrospect, a lot of people think that there was not enough debate, so that we probably should have had more facts on the table when we went into the war. The same is true with the Iraq War. That was bipartisan. There were Democrats that voted for that, but in retrospect, a lot of members were voting for that because they thought that it would be short, and also they wanted to burnish and shine up their national security and defense credentials, but they were bipartisan. But in retrospect, maybe there should have been more partisanship, actually.
You mentioned the issue with anti-intellectualism. Do you believe we need to make more steps in order to avoid anti-intellectualism, such as like funding on education and issues like that?
Well, I do. I think that that the movement that is anti-intellectual is really playing to the lesser angels in people, and my approach would be to play to the better angels in people, and not to make such emotional appeals to people that are raw and will will really turn people against their government. I'm afraid of where it goes, and I'm just hoping, I'm thinking that American people can handle it and they will sort it out. But I think in a time of high unemployment and frustration, that you could lead to very intense feelings on scapegoating of people and racism and so forth. So I just don't like the trend. I wish it were brought back, and then I think if you get more into the sphere of civility and comedy, then you're talking more factual arguments than you are base emotion and hardcore emotional arguments.
Yeah, politics has always been a bit anti-intellectual. The holy grail of politics is to reduce your campaign to a bumper sticker or a slogan on a billboard. And that is an overly simplistic way to deal with any of the problems that we have in our modern complicated economy and in our very complex society. And people and politicians need to take a little more time and think their way through these issues, and not just say you're a socialist or you're a fascist. That isn't good enough. You have to debate the issue and learn something about it before you make decisions.
Especially if you don't even know what the terms mean, really. And would you agree with me? You have to read. I mean, I know that sounds silly, but I know that the people in this room and the ages that they are probably don't read as much as when you all were their age. And I don't know, I don't want to say much about my reading abilities, but I'm just saying you have to read to know. You have to understand. You have to read more. You can't just go to the headline. You can't just read the blog. You can't just read the tweet. You have to read. You have to understand an issue. Right, and then you have to have conversations about it.
Right. It's what you read as well. I mean, do you read something that's balanced? You read both sides, and then you come to a conclusion. The lady asked a question about education, and that, of course, we've got to continue to spend more, and not spend more, but necessarily, but to refine our education system and have the best in the world. That should always be our goal, because education is the key to success. It is the foundation of our economy, and it keeps a civil society civil.
Regarding healthcare, would either of you two gentlemen turn in your benefits to take Obama's plan?
You're talking to a very privileged class of person up here, because we are covered by Medicare, and we are obliging our great-grandchildren and grandchildren to pay for that Medicare, so it's quite cheap for us. And in addition, we have at least I have a Blue Cross policy, mostly paid for by the government, which was awarded me when I retired, and the taxpayers are paying about 3/4 or 2/3 of that as well. So I have perfect medical care, so whatever Obama's doing couldn't possibly equal my wonderful status. And so I wouldn't trade it for anything.
I think that's a no on that one.
But it is highway robbery for the taxpayers and worse robbery for my grandchildren and great-grandchildren.
I just have to let you know, I am not yet eligible for Medicare. So
I was going to say, you were kind of speaking for both of you there.
I know I look 65, but I'm not yet eligible. I get my health care through my employer. I want to just make sure I address something here. There's an urban legend that if you have served in Congress for 2 terms, 1 term, that you take that health care with you for the rest of your life. Anybody ever heard that on the internet? Well, that is not true, and it is not true. While you're in Congress, you have pretty good health care, and the best thing you have is the attending physician. But anyway,
so let me make this clear. So if Obama turned to you and said, would you like to take on my plan, would your answer be yes or no?
Well, the thing about the Obama plan is that if you are covered by your employer, is that you keep that, and then if you leave or you leave your job, you can take that insurance with you with the company that you have. And I think that's a good thing.
Actually, about that young man that you were speaking about, that you overheard. Yeah. And I have a question about, because as the discussions get more heated, it seems more that the American people are really trying to fit into different political groups instead of actually leading America into a place there that they want them to go. And I really want to know that your take on who's really leading the bipartisanship, where these political parties are going.
Well, I think the problem is that very few people are talking about bipartisanship, particularly the leaders of the parties, whose job it is to make the policy and to make the charge for whatever they believe is the proper policy. I think where you find the leadership moving toward bipartisanship and toward more comity is in the younger, and I mean by this less senior members of the Congress or other legislative bodies, parliamentary bodies, who yearn to solve problems jointly and who look for ways to cooperate, who want to act with some collegiality in solving these problems, knowing that even though I may think my problem is best, if 50% of the country doesn't like it, I really ought to concede some of Larry's points for whatever his policy is. I don't think you're ever going to find the leaders of the parties, the leaders of the parties in the Congress, looking like they're going to lead the bipartisan charge. I think they've got their responsibility is to lead their party. I think you have to look for people down within the party a little lower, and those are the ones who are going to have to make the arrangements when you actually change the policy.
I would just add that, you know, with the media that we have now and the sort of the constant election cycles that sort of mesh together now, that we're already talking about 2012. There was an article the other day about Dick Cheney's daughter and Sarah Palin and Mitt Romney and who's going to carry the torch for the Republicans. It's assumed that Barack Obama will, obviously for the Democrats. But there's something that I think you should all watch in politics that has a great deal to do with civility and comity and bipartisanship, and that is the money. And the role of money in politics. And if I were you, I would focus a lot on how we are handling the money aspects and what role money plays in politics and how it either brings us together or tears us apart, because there's an awful lot of it, and it takes time away from legislating and doing what we need to do to get together anymore, to share ideas and to become more bipartisan. So I've enjoyed this, and thank you for having me. I guess
Thank you.
Yeah.
We're done with this one. Thank you all very much. Good questions.